I'll never forget the time I visited my grandfather's village, a place so remote that it felt like stepping into another world. The village was small, nestled deep within a dense forest, and it had a strange, eerie quietness to it, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the village, but there was one story he never told me. I had to learn that one for myself. It was during my first night there that I noticed something was off. The villagers were friendly during the day, but as soon as the sun began to set, they hurried to their homes, locking their doors and windows. The village, which had been so lively in the daylight, became a ghost town at night. When I asked my grandfather about it, he just told me to stay inside after dark and not to ask questions. But I was young and my curiosity got the better of me. That night, after my grandfather had gone to bed, I decided to find out what the villagers were so afraid of. I waited until the house was silent, then quietly slipped out into the night. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy of trees above. As I walked through the empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The village, which had been so silent, now seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible sound, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. I kept walking, drawn by a strange, magnetic pull toward the heart of the village. That's when I saw it. In the middle of the village square stood an old, weathered well. It looked ancient, its stones covered in moss, and it was surrounded by a ring of dead, withered plants. There was something deeply unsettling about it, but I couldn't look away. I approached the well, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I peered over the edge, I felt a sudden chill, as if the air around me had dropped several degrees. The well was deep, so deep that I couldn't see the bottom. But then I heard it, coming from the darkness below, a soft, rhythmic sound almost like a heartbeat. Thump thump, thump thump. It was slow, deliberate, and it echoed up from the depths, sending a shiver down my spine. My heart began to race as the sound grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was down there was getting closer. I backed away from the well, my hands trembling, but before I could turn to run, I heard a voice, soft, melodic, and utterly hypnotic. "Help me." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was coming from the well, from deep within its darkness. It was a woman's voice, pleading, desperate. "Please, help me." Against my better judgment, I moved closer, my curiosity battling with my fear. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. The voice responded, "I'm trapped, so cold, please." I hesitated, my mind racing. It could have been a trick, some kind of illusion, but the desperation in her voice felt real. I looked around, but the village was still deserted. No one was coming to help. It was just me and the well. Taking a deep breath, I leaned over the edge and called down, "How can I help you?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then the voice spoke again, "Lower the bucket, please." I spotted the old rusty crank on the side of the well and slowly began to lower the bucket. The sound of the rope unraveling echoed in the stillness, and the heartbeat sound from below grew louder, quicker, as if the well itself was alive. Suddenly, the crank jerked in my hands as if something had grabbed the bucket from below. I nearly let go, but I held on, struggling to pull it back up. It felt heavier than it should have, like I was lifting something far more than just water. The heartbeat sound was deafening now, pounding in my ears, and the voice was no longer soft. It was screaming, "Help me, help me, let me out." With one final heave, I yanked the bucket up and over the edge of the well. But what came out wasn't water, it was a hand. A pale, cold, bony hand gripping the edge of the bucket with claw-like fingers. I stumbled back in horror as the rest of the figure emerged from the well, a woman or what was left of her. Her skin was a sickly gray, stretched tight over her bones, and her eyes were hollow, dark voids. Her hair hung in wet, matted clumps, and she was soaked from head to toe, water dripping from her ragged clothes. She was nothing more than a corpse, yet she moved with a terrifying, unnatural speed. She lunged at me, her mouth opening in a silent scream, revealing rows of sharp, broken teeth. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, but I could hear her behind me, her footsteps slapping against the cobblestones as she chased me through the village. I didn't stop until I was back at my grandfather's house, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath, my body shaking with fear. Outside, the night was silent again as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The next morning, I told my grandfather what had happened. His face turned pale, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. He told me that the well was cursed, that it was once a sacred place where villagers would make offerings to keep the spirits at bay. But one night many years ago, a woman had thrown herself into the well, her heart filled with despair. Her spirit had been trapped there ever since, angry and vengeful, luring anyone foolish enough to come close. We left the village that day and I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the sound of her voice, whispering in the darkness, pleading for help. And I know that the curse of the old well is still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to lower the bucket and release her wrath.